Today we're going over a dialogue between Dax Cowart and Robert Burt. So to give you a little background, Dax Cowart was seriously injured in a horrible accident in 1973, leaving him blind and without the use of his hands, and with burns on over 2/3 of his body. The treatment for the burns was excruciatingly painful. He tried to refuse treatment and demanded to be allowed to die. He was recognized as competent by a psychiatrist. Nonetheless, he was forced to undergo these painful procedures. His case provoked serious debate about patients' autonomy and their right to refuse treatment and when they're allowed to decide when to die. So this lecture is my notes on the dialogue between him, Dax Cowart, and the physician, Dr. Robert Burt. They had been longtime correspondents, but this conversation in 1996 was the first time they had actually met in person. This lecture is my notes on the conversation that was recorded in the dialogue between Dax Cowart and Robert Burt in November of 1996 at Pacific Lutheran University. They had written to each other before, but this was the first time that they had actually spoken to each other in person. So in 1973, Dax Cowart was a 25-year-old man. He was the former captain of his high school football team, a former Air Force pilot, rodeo rider, and aspiring commercial pilot. In the summer of 1973, Dax was seriously injured in a random gas line explosion that killed his father and left him with burns on 65% of his total body surface area, with third-degree burns on his face, ears, and hands. Most of his fingers had to be amputated, and he lost vision in both of his eyes. According to a farmer who was the first to arrive on the scene, Dax said, "Get me a gun. Can't you see I'm a dead man? I'm going to die anyway." Dax then spent the next 6 months in the hospital undergoing excruciatingly painful chlorine baths to help clean out the burn areas. And then he spent the next 8 months in a rehab facility, 14 months in total. During this time, he repeatedly requested that the medical team discontinue his treatment, even though his mother was the one who was consenting to the treatment. During his hospitalization in 1974, Dax made a famous video called "Let Me Die" with psychologist Robert White. White deemed Dax to be psychologically competent and deemed that he had decision-making capacities. Dax clearly asserted in the video that he did not want to live as a blind and crippled person. Still, the psychologists and the physicians ignored his request. Then he made a follow-up video in 1984 called Dax's Case. And then in 1986, Dax received his law degree from Texas Tech University. Since then, he has been a legal advocate for patients' rights. Burt started with 2 points where he thinks he agrees with Dax. First, before 1974, physicians predominantly had a paternalistic attitude towards their patients, to the point where many were violating the patient's autonomy. Also, Burt agrees that Dax's case and his actions have been crucial to identifying the wrongness with this approach to the patient-doctor relationship. But still, Burt is very cautious about embracing this norm of patient autonomy. He thinks that he starts with this idea that autonomy as an extreme version, that the physician should do whatever the patient says. But obviously, this extreme version is wrong. So thinking about Dax's case, when Dax says, "I don't want to be treated," the physician should not just agree and withhold treatment. According to Burt, the physicians, as a person entangled in the patient's life, has an obligation to push back, maybe even strenuously, and challenge the patient's refusal of treatment. In the end, respecting autonomy is going to be acknowledging that it's their choice and not mine. But Burt questions when that conversation should end. It seems like at least after the patient has been given enough information to make an informed decision, but when is that? Specifically, Burt brings up that most of our experiences have been as able-bodied persons, and as a result, most people tend to have an ableist bias. Any person who would have gone through such a traumatic experience that's beyond their control would inevitably look at the situations with those same biases. Burt's challenge is that these biases prevent patients like Dax from being able to actually make an informed decision. So Burt then reads from a conversation between Dax and Dr. White. Dr. White said to Dax, "From the very beginning, according to what you've told me and to what's been written in your hospital record, you had very strong feelings that you did not want the doctors to go on with your treatment, that you wanted them to leave you alone and to not sustain your life. How do you feel about that at this point?" Dax said in response, "At this point, I feel very much the same way. If I felt that I could be rehabilitated to where I could walk or do other things normally, I might have different feelings about it. I don't know. But being blind itself is one big factor that influences my thinking on this matter. I don't know that there is any way I would want to go on as a blind and cripple." So Burt's question for Dax is, how realistic was his perception at this point just a few months after the accident? How realistic was his the full range of capacities that would eventually be open to him, even if he was permanently blind and eventually or unable to walk, even though he was eventually able to? How much contact had he had with people with significant disabilities at that point? How much was he devaluing his own capacities? It seems like Dax's judgments were clouded by these very common able-bodied fears. How realistic is someone in Dax's situation realistically able to understand the possibilities open to them? How can Dr. Burt be a better communicator and be able to fully and believably communicate what the real ranges of options are to a disabled person that they are not able to see because of these ableist biases and the able-bodied self-image that they still have? Well, you can bring people to talk into bring people to come in to talk to the patient to help them see these full range of options, but that's still going to take a while. On top of that, they need to attend to the patient's psychological trauma. Specifically with Dax, it would have been helping him deal with the loss of his father. All of this is to say that it's not clear how long the conversation should go on for, or as what Burt keeps referring to as when the end of the day should be. The right to control one's own body is a right that we're all born with. This is not a right that we're given by society or the government or physicians or even your next of kin. It is wrong to amputate someone's limbs or to take out their organs or to administer any kind of medical treatment without that patient's consent. So according to Dax, there is no legitimate law or authority that can take this right away from you. So to make sense of this, he cites a couple different sources. So first, he cites a Mark Twain story, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. This was to show that even in the late 1800s, letting the patients die and have the right to choose that was clearly in the zeitgeist. In this story, letting the people die as a result of the plague was seen as the merciful action rather than resuscitating them and seeing that all of their family had died and possibly living with deformities and side effects from the plague. So then we can also look to the U.S. legal thought in the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Louis Brandeis said, "The makers of our Constitution sought to protect Americans and their beliefs and their thoughts and their emotions and their sensations. They confer as against the government the right to be left alone, the most comprehensive of rights and the right most valued by civilized man." Justice Warren Burger clarifies, "Nothing suggests that Justice Brandeis thought of individuals possessing these rights only as to sensible beliefs, valid thoughts, reasonable emotions, or well-founded sensations. I suggest that he intended to include a great many foolish, unreasonable, or even absurd ideas that do not conform, such as refusing medical treatment even at great risk." So Justice Burger is not trying to advocate for individuals to do foolish, unreasonable, or absurd actions. Rather, he is emphasizing the importance for individuals making their own decisions, even if those decisions might seem foolish, unreasonable, or absurd to others. So English poet John Keats wrote, "Until we are sick, we understand not," which these words seem to ring true for Dax. He thought that we cannot fully appreciate what the situation's like until we're actually in that position. Furthermore, even his memory blocks out some of the pain, so even he can't fully understand it anymore. So then he turns to English philosopher John Stuart Mill, and in his work on liberty, Mill divides rights into two groups. We have self-regarding and other-regarding rights. According to this view, an action is self-regarding, then the individual should be the one to make their own decisions. So for Dax, this is going to capture his view very well. A physician needs to get the patient's voluntary informed consent. Forms of coercion, telling half-truths, or withholding a full measure of risk and benefit can undermine the patient's consent and thus violate the patient's autonomy. Whether in a hospital or out in the world, people still expect to have the right to make their own decisions. So fortunately, since Dax's hospital stay in the 70s, patients have gained many new protections, such as advanced directives, durable power of attorneys, or other healthcare proxies. Unfortunately, some studies have shown that about half the time physicians have actually ignored these directives, or at least that was the case in the 90s when this was recorded. So the main reason that Dax wanted to end the treatment was because of the excruciating pain that he had to endure during the treatment. Dax was surprised that physicians were all right with subjecting the patients to this much pain. Then later he found out that there was more that they could have done. The secondary issue for Dax was the quality of life that he was facing. Dax did not feel that living life as a blind, disfigured, and without his fingers, and at the time he wasn't sure he'd be able to walk, that kind of life would be worth leading. Since then, he's now admitted that he was wrong about that. Nonetheless, freedom is the ability to make your own decisions, even if that means letting someone make the wrong choice. Still, this question about quality of life obscures the immediate issue, that his pain was not being adequately attended to. Dax has since gone on to be more physically active than he originally thought he could have been. He also emphasizes that this does not vindicate the physician's decision to violate his autonomy. To say that would be to say that the ends justify the means. But this approach totally ignores the pain that the patient is having to experience. So Dax often asks himself if the same thing were to happen today under identical circumstances, knowing what he knows now, would he still want the freedom to refuse treatment and die? And the answer that he finds himself saying is resoundingly yes. The main reason is that the pain that he had to go through, it was excruciating and unbearable. He acknowledges that someone else might make a different choice, but that's the point that he points out that is the beauty of freedom. It's their choice to do so. Burt acknowledges that Dax would have made the same decision, and then asks him to suppose that there's someone else in a similar situation, and this person says, "I don't want to be treated, stop now." So Burt asks Dax, what would he say to this person? The simple answer is what Burt suggested earlier, that physicians are attentive to the patient's concerns. Dax is not suggesting that the physicians just give up and walk away. He believes that the physicians have a duty to inform the patients about what can honestly be done and then respond to the patient's concerns. In the case that Burt is just talking about, Dax would say to the patient, what are your concerns? The patient would likely say something like, the pain. Then Dax would say, well, what if we could better manage that pain? The patient may say yes, or they may say no. Dax would offer his perspective, the positives and the negatives. He'd be realistic about the options, and he would not skirt any of the problems. For example, a lot of people do not have good post-hospital care. Many have to rely on underfunded government agencies. Burt's not quite sure where they're going to disagree. He agrees that people have the right to make autonomous choices. Still, he thinks the crucial question is, how should the right of autonomy be implemented? Going back to the case with the patient, let's say that their pain is the main reason that they want to end treatment. Let's say that Dax would offer them the same kind of pain relief that was available, but not offered to him at the time. Yes. How would Dax respond if the patient said, "Don't fight for me, go away. My life is not worth living. I don't care about what possibility of getting on top of this pain is, just go away"? At some point you have to say, all right, it's your decision. Yes, but when is that point? One day, 1 week? How long is it permissible to argue with them? I'm not arguing with them, it's confronting them and discussing it with them. Yeah, but what do you mean by confront? There's nothing wrong with taking the opposite position and having a lively debate. Thinking back in the 7 years it took before you felt like life was worth living again, would you say to that patient, although the 7 years might seem like a long and difficult time, from the other side it was worth it? Well, that would be the honest answer. But if they still persisted, they say, no, you're different from me, and I just can't do it. Well, it comes back to Burt's question about when is the end of the day. There doesn't seem to be a principled way to determine how long this conversation should go on. Rather, it seems like we should be looking at the details of each circumstance. In Dax's case, he thought that the conversation should have lasted only a day, though in other cases it might be more like a week or maybe a month. The paternalistic model of medicine has been an issue, and until we get rid of it, we cannot rely on guidelines for physicians to use in these circumstances. Specifically, the worry is that if we set these standards, physicians are just going to default to the longest amount of time and violate the patient's autonomy.
Mr. Burt, when is it okay for a doctor to say to a patient who refuses life-saving treatment, "I agree with you. The patient's in a lot of pain, she's suffering and has a chronic illness." When is it okay to say, "All right, you can call an end to it"? When is the end of the day? When is it appropriate to acknowledge that to the patient?
Two things. First, there must be an end of the day. Otherwise, the physician is clearly disrespecting the patient. Second, from the beginning of the conversation, it must be clear that at the end of the conversation, it is the patient's choice. Then, Burt is asking for the patient to be given time to convince the patient to continue with the treatment. When physicians are given the time, they are then taking on a special responsibility, and they should be particularly attentive to the patient's time. This responsibility is enormously burdensome for the caretaker, and the caretaker should not make any of these promises and then go to abandon them by doing something like going on vacation. Does that answer your question?
Not really. As Dax said earlier, he had torturous pain. Now, are you saying that this patient should go through suffering for this delayed extended dialogue that you want?
When I say give me time, I don't mean to go down to the cafeteria to get some food because I'm hungry. Rather, by give me time, Burt is asking for time to get the resources to help the patient through the treatment, including alleviating the patient's pain. Then, if those resources are no help or they're not available, then the physician should come back to the patient and say, all right, this is enough. Burt's point is simply that the physician should be given time to do their jobs, to do what they were trained to do. Not giving them that time frustrates them as caregivers. Dax suggests that the physician should establish a rapport with the patients. He currently feels like there's a professional distance that physicians and the patients have, and he thinks that this is going to be counterproductive to medicine. For example, there was a physician who thought that an operation might help give Dax more use of his hands, but Dax refused because the last surgery had been so painful. In contrast, a medical student had had a lot of friendly heart-to-hearts and had asked Dax to open up about his experience. After opening up about his experience, the medical student had guaranteed that he would help keep Dax out of pain if he went through with the surgery. Dax was initially hesitant, but after talking to the director of the burn ward, who also reassured him, then he went ahead with the surgery. The director of the burn ward kept his word and helped alleviate Dax's pain. And so, yeah, this is what Dax thought a model of compassionate understanding should be used instead of requiring a patient to have conversations over an extended period of time.
Mr. Cowart, you have focused a lot on the physicians up to this point. How were you treated by your nurses?
Generally, Dax found the nurses to be very caring, compassionate, and understanding, especially compared to the physicians. But this was also just a generalization. He's not sure how much of this is based on gender or the training they receive, but Dax suspects that it's a little bit of both. Generally, nurses tend to have better understanding and empathy for the patients than most of the physicians.
Mr. Burt, I'm an RN and a hospice nurse. I have 2 patients right now. Both of them have recliners, both of them have TV remotes, both of them have morphine, and both of them have pain. In the last 2 weeks, one patient said, "I have everything I need. I have my recliner, my remote, my morphine, and I'm fine." The other patient said, "I hate my life. All I have is this stinking recliner and TV and my morphine. This isn't a life." Now, in the last week, one of those patients has died because he made a decision to stop all of his medication except his morphine, and he died. I was not ready for him to die, but he was ready to die. If I had argued with him, whose need would be met? It would not be his need, would it?
Burt agrees that stopping this patient would have been inappropriate. Maybe he thinks that using the term arguing is causing some problems. He suggests importuning or offering to explore reasons behind their decision. The point seems to be just to not take the patient's initial statement at face.
I mean, we talked a lot.
That seems all right. A lot of this seems to be based on particular individual interactions, and it seems like from this brief description that you've reached what Burt's been calling the end of the day. It sounds like you cultivated the kind of committed, caring relationship that is necessary for this situation. Generally, hospice care is different than other parts of the medical profession, and these settings enable caregivers to cultivate those kinds of necessary relationships. Still, there is a place for caregivers to lovingly challenge their patients. And when they do, they have to ask, whose needs are they really trying to meet? Is the caregiver doing it for the patient, or are they doing it for the patient and themselves? It's really difficult to draw a clear boundary between doing things out of self-interested motives and others-centered motives. He suggests turning this case around. Consider difficult patients, specifically the ones who are inconsolable and relentlessly complain even when you're helping them. Now, suppose one of them says that they want to be let go. They want to be let out. If the caregiver lets them go, whose needs are they really serving? He suggests that it is this situation in which many caregivers find themselves questioning their motives. The goal is to principally work for the patient's needs and then secondarily for your own needs, but that's not always so easy to obtain. He suggests that people find this balance through struggle, sweat, honesty, and reflection.
Mr. Cowart, I'm trying to understand your thinking. You were in the hospital and kept saying you wanted to die, and then you were released home without much care. You said it took 7 years for you to turn your life around, but you did. You didn't kill yourself. At what point did you say, "I want to live"?
He was not exactly sure where or when, but generally sometime when he was in the burn ward, when he was told that he was going to live regardless of whether he had the last skin graft operation or not. That's when he told himself that he's going to make the best of this bad situation. Even still, though, it was pretty tough for him to do. He tried to kill himself 3 times in the 7 years after he left the hospital. He had gotten into law school, but he really struggled to function. It was not until 1980 when Dr. White helped him with his sleep that he was really able to see his life turn around.
Mr. Cowart, it seems to me that you're a perfect example of what now seems to be success in spite of any physical disability. Do you now feel at all grateful thinking back? Are you glad the doctors fought your request to die?
Dax is not grateful for anyone who was fighting his right to request to die, But he is grateful that, they were honestly trying to act in his best interest. But no, he's not grateful that he was forcibly treated because the pain was pure hell. We should not lose sight of how painful pain can really be.
In fighting for your right to choose your fate, were you also fighting physically against the care that was forced upon you? Were you physically trying to refuse treatment?
Yes, Dax tried everything he could to keep them away.
Do you suppose that this fight within you, this struggle, this energy you were putting out, actually made you live?
So yeah, he agreed that, the energy might have actually helped him live. So he told this anecdote about a nurse on the burn ward who was there before he got there, but she was apparently really rough on her patients, so much so that some of her patients allegedly wanted to kill her. But the other nurses started to notice that some of her patients were actually living longer than normal. And he suggested that maybe this passion, even if it's negative, is still helping.
Mr. Cowart, at the time that you were fighting against treatment, your mother was fighting for continued treatment. Did you consider an attorney at that time?
Dax tried to get legal representation many times to help him with his right to refuse treatment. First, he had a personal injury attorney who was representing him on the case against the company that was supposed to maintain the pipeline that had exploded. This attorney was connected to him through the family, and his mom wasn't helping him get any help, so this attorney wasn't helping him either. Although he did advocate to the physicians, saying that they need to keep him out of pain and that it's ridiculous that they're not doing more to help him with that. Dax had tried to ask other friends and family, but they would not help him get any legal representation. He tried to ask the staff to help him get to a phone, but they wouldn't help him, and they wouldn't let him use the phone that was at the nurse's station. He tried to dictate a letter to a nurse. It was addressed to his uncle, but unbeknownst to Dax, it just ended up in a doctor's file. So ostensibly, the patient does have a right not to be treated, but without someone actually at the hospital with the authority willing to enforce it, it's really difficult to enforce. It was the physician who was brought in to declare Dax incompetent, Dr. White, who ultimately declared him competent and was the first to get him any kind of legal representation. The attorney that Dr. White helped him find came down from Dallas, and they talked for a little bit, and the attorney said he would do what he could, but Dax never heard back from him.
Mr. Cowart, when you were first injured, if your intractable pain had been effectively managed, do you think that your attitude would have been different? Do you think you might have had a very different outlook as to prolonging your life? Do you think that the pain was really the main issue that wasn't being addressed by your physicians and the medical community, and that interfered with your ability to really look at the future?
This is often a concern of many medical professionals, including Dr. White. Another similar concern was whether Dax had an issue with control, and once he was shown that he was in control, that he would actually want to be treated. However, that was just not the case. The main motivating factor was the pain that he was feeling in that present moment. He knew that it would eventually go away, but he was unwilling to tolerate it long enough to go beyond that pain. If the pain had been competently managed, then he might still not continue with the treatment. With better pain management and then overall support with post-treatment care, maybe he could have been persuaded and gone ahead with the treatment. But it just wasn't the case. The first psychiatrist was not called in until a year into his hospitalization. And that was Dr. White. And Dr. White was only called in to declare him incompetent. However, he didn't, and neither did the second psychiatrist.
Mr. Burt, I get the impression that both the medical profession and the society assume temporary incompetence in anybody who is in severe pain or in severe emotional grief. Do you take the word of somebody in severe pain at that moment truly as their decision? Is a presumption of temporary incompetence justifiable?
Burt thinks the phrase presumption of temporary incompetence is a little disrespectful and we should not really be using that as a principle. Rather, grief and extraordinary pain deserve a particular response from the caregivers. Specifically, caregivers should approach the situation with an attitude that they are going to help the patient through the treatment and they're not going to abandon them. People in these particular situations are experiencing extreme hopelessness, so it can take a lot to reassure them, not just using your words, but also by being there when it counts. So no, Burt does not think that this is incompetence, but rather he thinks that this is a natural human response to such a severe situation.
It seems to me that you, Mr. Cowart, actually made a very articulate defense of Mr. Burt's position when you so ably identified the essentials of informed consent, making the very clear point, well respected and recognized in medical legal law, that informed volitional consent demands a full appraisal and understanding of the risks and benefits of the therapy. The difficulty that I see Mr. Burt focusing on here is that these decisions don't take place instantaneously in time. Even a patient who is not in pain, to make a fully informed decision about the risks versus the benefits of treatment, has to be able to appropriate a different set of attitudes and expectations, and the process for that is one of knowledge and dialogue and information. Setting aside the pain issue, which ought to be aggressively manageable, how does your own experience help us understand how to balance respecting the patient's request with confidence that enough time has been given to the patient to allow a truly informed personal assessment of what the risks and benefits are?
If the pain is really not an issue, and there's no other issues present that would analogously require immediate attention, then Dax is not as nearly as inclined for such a short time. Rather, he would probably be more favorable for a timeline that looks like a few weeks, maybe even a month, but definitely not a whole year. The physician being able to work with the patient in this way without any immediate issues like pain would probably be a really good thing. Since we're all different, it's still difficult to determine how much would be a sufficient amount of time from the patient's point of view. We would all like to be in full control of all of our decisions, but at the same time, most of us are willing to give up at least some autonomy in the interest of making better decisions. It's really difficult to determine when the end of the day has come, as Dr. Burt has been calling it. But there doesn't seem to be a clear way to protect the patient when they say, okay, I've heard you out, I've tried, but I've had enough. I'm not ready for this one. What am I doing? If the pain is not really the issue, then there's no other issues that would present no other present issues that would be analogously require immediate attention, then he's not nearly as inclined for a short time. I don't care about the possibility of getting on top of this pain. I just want to go away. That you wanted them to leave you alone and not to attempt to sustain your life. How do you feel about